Across the globe, from Johannesburg to Rome, Africans are waking up. In a shocking twist, Italy's Prime Minister, Giorgia Meloni, speaks out against France's colonial grip on Africa. Her bold stance has sparked global debates. But it's not just words. It's a movement. Captain Ibrahim Traoré, a symbol of resistance, is now at the center of Africa's fight for sovereignty. But will Western powers allow Africa to rise? The world is watching, and Africa is speaking loud and clear. The battle for Africa's future has begun, and at its center stands Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso. The world is watching as this young revolutionary leads the charge for African sovereignty, rejecting foreign manipulation and colonial legacies. In Burkina Faso, a movement is growing, a movement that could reshape not just the future of one nation, but the entire African continent. The story begins in the heart of the Sahel, where Burkina Faso's leader has taken an unprecedented stand against Western powers, particularly France, for their long-standing influence over African resources. The spark that ignited this revolution was a simple but powerful question: who controls the resources of Africa? When U.S. General Michael Langley accused Captain Traoré of hoarding the country's resources, it was clear that this wasn't just a fight for Burkina Faso. It was a fight for Africa's dignity and future. The accusation against Traoré wasn't just a political maneuver. It was part of a broader strategy to discredit African leaders who were seeking to break free from the chains of neocolonialism. By accusing Traoré of hoarding wealth, Langley was attempting to turn the narrative around, to paint the leader of Burkina Faso as a corrupt tyrant, as if he were merely another African leader hoarding his country's resources for personal gain. But for many Africans, this claim rang hollow. To them, this was just another attempt by Western powers to manipulate the continent, keeping it divided and dependent on foreign aid. And so, the response to Langley's accusations was swift and powerful. Captain Ibrahim Traoré rejected the claims, pointing out that Burkina Faso had been systematically exploited by colonial powers for centuries. The people of Burkina Faso, Traoré argued, were the rightful owners of the country's resources. This fight wasn't just about one man or one leader. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from them. But the struggle didn't stop there. It became clear that the revolution in Burkina Faso had global implications. The echoes of Traoré's defiance were being heard across Africa. From the streets of Lomé to the halls of power in Addis Ababa, Africans were beginning to see a leader who was willing to stand up to the West and challenge the colonial systems that had long kept them in chains. Leaders from Mali, Niger, and other countries in the Sahel were watching closely, ready to join the struggle for African sovereignty. They too had suffered under the weight of foreign powers, with their natural resources being extracted and sold to the highest bidder, while their people remained in poverty. Burkina Faso's revolution became a beacon of hope for those seeking to regain control of their countries, their economies, and their futures. But even as support for the revolution grew, so did the resistance. The West, particularly France, could not allow such a bold challenge to its control over Africa. Diplomatic pressure on Burkina Faso mounted, with foreign powers attempting to isolate the country from the international community. Sanctions were imposed, and attempts to destabilize the government increased. Rebel groups, many of them backed by foreign nations, began to infiltrate the country, making it clear that the West would stop at nothing to prevent Burkina Faso from succeeding in its quest for sovereignty. But despite these challenges, the people of Burkina Faso remained resolute. They knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but they were prepared to fight for their future. The revolution had become more than just a political movement. It had become a fight for Africa's dignity and independence. And as the world watched, the people of Burkina Faso stood united, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. But the battle was not just about Burkina Faso. It was about the entire African continent. For decades, African nations had been trapped in a system that allowed foreign powers to control their resources and manipulate their governments. The revolution in Burkina Faso was the spark that could ignite a larger fire, a fire that could spread across Africa, challenging the colonial legacies that still hold the continent in thrall. This was Africa's moment. The question that now loomed over Burkina Faso was not just whether the revolution would succeed, but whether it could inspire a broader movement across the continent. The implications were enormous. Would other African nations rise to the occasion, rejecting foreign domination and reclaiming their resources? Or would Burkina Faso stand alone in its fight for sovereignty? The world was watching as this revolutionary movement took shape. And as the stakes grew higher, it became clear that this struggle was not just about Burkina Faso's future. It was about the future of Africa itself. For the first time in decades, African nations were united in their desire for change. The people of Burkina Faso had taken a stand, and now the world would see if they could hold their ground against the forces that had kept Africa under foreign control for so long. As the revolution in Burkina Faso gained momentum, the world began to take notice. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership was transforming the political landscape, not only of Burkina Faso but of Africa as a whole. His defiance against Western powers had ignited a wave of solidarity across the continent. Leaders from Mali, Niger, and other African nations began to rally behind him, understanding that his fight was not just for Burkina Faso's future, it was for Africa's future. The rise of Traoré was not just a political event. It was a symbol of Africa's awakening, an awakening from the long nightmare of exploitation and foreign manipulation. The events unfolding in Burkina Faso were shaking the very foundations of the global power structure. Burkina Faso was not the only country to face the weight of Western influence. Across Africa, nations had been subjected to years of exploitation, their resources siphoned away while their people remained trapped in poverty. The gold, oil, and minerals that flowed from the continent had made foreign powers rich, but left Africa in a state of underdevelopment and stagnation. This inequality had persisted for centuries, but Captain Ibrahim Traoré's bold move to take control of Burkina Faso's resources marked a turning point. His refusal to bow to foreign interests was a direct challenge to a system that had kept Africa chained to the whims of Western powers. However, the road ahead was far from easy. While the revolution gained traction within Burkina Faso and across the continent, it was met with fierce opposition from foreign powers, particularly France. France had long maintained its influence over Burkina Faso, primarily through control of its resources and political maneuvering. But as Burkina Faso moved towards self-determination, France's grip on the country weakened. French officials were quick to denounce Traoré's actions, accusing him of destabilizing the region and threatening the delicate balance of power that had kept Africa's resources under control. The accusations were not new. They were part of a long-standing pattern used by Western powers to discredit African leaders who dared to challenge the status quo. But this time, the people of Burkina Faso were not backing down. Traoré's defiance became a rallying cry for Africans across the continent, symbolizing the fight for sovereignty and freedom. The growing unrest in Burkina Faso was not just a reflection of local dissatisfaction. It was part of a larger trend that was sweeping across Africa. The rise of anti-imperialist sentiment and the desire for self-determination had begun to resonate with millions of Africans who had long been disenfranchised by foreign control. Burkina Faso's revolution became a beacon of hope for those who believed that Africa's future could no longer be dictated by foreign powers. However, the challenges facing Burkina Faso were enormous. The country's resources were under attack, and its economy was being suffocated by the sanctions imposed by the West. The government, under Traoré's leadership, found itself fighting not just a political battle, but a battle for survival. Rebel groups, many of them supported by foreign interests, began to emerge, attempting to destabilize the country further. It became clear that the revolution was no longer just about reclaiming resources. It was about defending the country's sovereignty against both internal and external threats. Despite the growing challenges, the people of Burkina Faso remained steadfast. They had seen the consequences of foreign exploitation for too long. They had seen how their resources were plundered by multinational corporations and foreign governments, while their own people remained trapped in poverty. They knew that if they did not stand up now, they would never have another chance to take control of their future. As the revolution continued, it began to draw comparisons to other African struggles for freedom. The situation in Burkina Faso echoed the struggles of countries like Libya, where Colonel Muammar Gaddafi had risen to power as a champion of African unity and sovereignty, only to be overthrown by foreign-backed forces. Like Gaddafi, Traoré was seen as a leader willing to challenge Western hegemony. But unlike Gaddafi, Traoré had learned from history. He understood the risks of foreign intervention, and he knew that the survival of Burkina Faso's revolution depended on keeping external forces at bay. The situation in Burkina Faso was not just about politics, it was about survival. Traoré's government was facing tremendous pressure, and the future of the revolution remained uncertain. But as the revolutionaries in Burkina Faso held firm, it was clear that their struggle had ignited a movement across Africa. The fight for sovereignty and freedom in Burkina Faso was no longer just a local issue, it was a Pan-African struggle. Africa's leaders were beginning to understand that their futures depended on their ability to break free from the chains of foreign exploitation. They were no longer willing to be pawns in the global game. They were ready to take control of their own destinies. The world was watching as Burkina Faso's revolution unfolded. The question remained, would the people of Burkina Faso succeed in their struggle for independence, or would the forces of imperialism crush their hopes? One thing was certain. Burkina Faso had become a symbol of resistance against the forces that had long held Africa down, and the fight for its future was far from over. As the situation in Burkina Faso deepened, the challenges became even more apparent. The revolution had gained widespread support from the people, but foreign powers, particularly France, continued to intensify their efforts to undermine the revolution. While many Africans stood in solidarity with Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the West viewed his rise to power as a direct threat to their dominance over Africa's resources. This global struggle was no longer just about one country. It was about the future of the entire African continent. Burkina Faso's revolution had become a symbol of Africa's potential to break free from foreign control. But as the months passed, the pressure from foreign nations grew. The Western-backed sanctions, economic pressure, and covert operations designed to destabilize the country were starting to have a visible impact. Traoré's government was being forced into a corner, yet the people of Burkina Faso remained unwavering in their support. The country's resources, gold, oil, and minerals, had long been exploited by foreign powers, and the revolution now represented a fight to take control of those resources. The people of Burkina Faso refused to allow their wealth to continue flowing into the pockets of multinational corporations and foreign governments. Instead, they wanted to use their resources to build a prosperous future for their own people. As tensions continued to rise, Traoré's leadership became more critical than ever. The revolution had begun as a movement for political change, but now it was a fight for economic independence. Burkina Faso's resources were not just being hoarded by the ruling elite, they were being stolen by foreign powers. The international community had long turned a blind eye to the exploitation of Africa's natural wealth, but Traoré's refusal to bow to foreign influence was shining a light on the hypocrisy of this global system. And for the first time, the people of Burkina Faso had the opportunity to use their resources to build a future for themselves, one that was free from the shackles of imperialism. But the road ahead was not without challenges. Burkina Faso's economy was already fragile, and the continued external pressure was beginning to show its effects. While Traoré and his supporters remained steadfast in their resolve, the country was facing economic instability. Foreign-backed rebel groups continued to infiltrate the country, and the government was forced to deal with both internal unrest and external threats. Despite this, the spirit of defiance within the country was palpable. The people had stood up against foreign domination, and now they were fighting for their sovereignty. The revolution was no longer just about overthrowing a leader, it was about reclaiming the soul of Africa. But while Burkina Faso's revolution was inspiring others across Africa, it also made them a target for the West. Countries like the United States and France had long relied on Africa's resources, and the rise of leaders like Traoré threatened to disrupt the global power dynamics. The West had no intention of allowing an African revolution to succeed, especially one that threatened their economic interests. In response to the growing movement for African sovereignty, the Western powers continued to push back, using economic sanctions and political pressure to undermine the revolution. The international community remained divided. Some African nations rallied behind Burkina Faso's fight for freedom, while others remained neutral or even sided with Western powers. But for those on the front lines, the message was clear. This was a fight for Africa's future. The revolution in Burkina Faso was not just about one country, it was about reclaiming Africa's resources, its wealth, and its future. As the revolution unfolded, the world saw that Burkina Faso was no longer willing to accept the status quo. The people of Burkina Faso had made it clear. They would no longer be slaves to foreign powers. They would take control of their future, and they would use their resources to build a better future for all of Africa. The revolution had sparked a fire across the continent. Leaders in Mali, Niger, and beyond began to rally behind the people of Burkina Faso, understanding that their fight was their fight too. The Pan-African movement was gaining strength, and the struggle for self-determination was spreading across Africa. But the West, determined to maintain its influence, continued to fight back. The battle for Africa's resources was far from over, and the world watched as Burkina Faso became the epicenter of a larger movement for African sovereignty. The question remained, would Burkina Faso be able to withstand the pressure from the West, or would the forces of imperialism crush its dreams of independence? As the revolution continued, one thing was clear. The struggle for Africa's future was only just beginning, and Burkina Faso, under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, was leading the charge. As Burkina Faso continued its battle for sovereignty, the intensity of the struggle reached new heights. Captain Ibrahim Traoré's leadership had brought the country to the brink of change, but it also exposed the deep divisions within the international community. While Africa was rallying behind Burkina Faso's revolution, the Western powers had grown increasingly hostile. The fight was no longer just about Burkina Faso, it was about Africa's future, and the West was not prepared to let go of its control. The economic pressure on Burkina Faso was relentless. Sanctions, trade restrictions, and attempts to cut off the country from international financial networks were the weapons of choice for foreign powers seeking to quell the revolution. But these measures only strengthened the resolve of the Burkinabe people. They had endured centuries of exploitation and oppression, and now they were fighting for a chance to determine their own future. As the Western powers continued to escalate their efforts, Burkina Faso found unexpected support. Across the continent, African nations began to rally behind the country's struggle for sovereignty. In Mali, Niger, and elsewhere, leaders spoke out in favor of Burkina Faso's revolution, acknowledging the need for Africa to take control of its resources and future. For the first time in history, African nations were beginning to unite against a common enemy, foreign powers that sought to maintain control over the continent. But despite this growing solidarity, the challenges faced by Burkina Faso were enormous. The revolution was not just political, it was economic, social, and cultural. The people of Burkina Faso had to rebuild a country that had been ravaged by years of exploitation. They had to create a new economic system, one that was free from the shackles of Western control. The country's rich resources, including gold, oil, and minerals, had been the key to its exploitation, but now they had the potential to become the foundation for a new independent future. However, this new vision for Burkina Faso was not without its obstacles. The country's infrastructure had been destroyed by years of war, and the people were facing severe shortages of food, medicine, and basic necessities. The economic sanctions imposed by the West were taking their toll, and the government was struggling to maintain order. Rebel groups, backed by foreign interests, continued to infiltrate the country, further destabilizing the situation. Despite these challenges, Traoré's leadership remained unwavering. He understood that the revolution was not just about military victories, it was about the hearts and minds of the people. And the people of Burkina Faso were united in their desire for change. The youth of the country, many of whom had grown up under the yoke of foreign dominance, were at the forefront of the revolution. They had seen the consequences of exploitation, and they were determined not to let the cycle continue. But even as the revolution gained momentum, the stakes grew higher. The West, particularly France, was not prepared to let Burkina Faso's revolution succeed. The French government, in particular, had invested too much in maintaining control over the country's resources to let it slip away without a fight. France's efforts to undermine the revolution grew more desperate. France, long seen as a colonial power in Africa, had continued to exploit the continent for its own gain. But as the revolution spread, the narrative was changing. For the first time, Africans were beginning to take control of their future. They were beginning to demand that their resources benefit their own people, not foreign corporations. The Western powers, particularly France, were now facing a challenge unlike any they had encountered before. The struggle for Africa's resources was no longer just about economics. It was about the very soul of the continent. and Africa's leaders, inspired by the revolution in Burkina Faso, were beginning to rise up against the forces of imperialism. The question was no longer whether Africa would rise. It was how quickly the continent would reclaim its power. As the revolution in Burkina Faso continued to unfold, the global community began to take notice. The fight for Burkina Faso's sovereignty had become the fight for Africa's sovereignty. This was not just about one country, it was about the entire continent. The question that remained was simple. Would Africa succeed in breaking free from the chains of colonialism and imperialism? Or would the forces that had long controlled the continent win once again? The world would soon find out. The revolution in Burkina Faso had only just begun, but the stakes were higher than ever. The people of Burkina Faso had already shown that they would not bow to foreign powers. They had shown that they would fight for their resources, their dignity, and their future. And now the world was watching to see if their vision of a sovereign Africa would become a reality. The revolution had begun in Burkina Faso, but its impact would be felt across the entire continent. As Burkina Faso's revolution continued to grow, it became clear that the people's resolve was unshakable. But while the masses stood firm in their support for Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the country's internal stability was under increasing strain. Political factions began to surface, each pushing for a different vision for the future of Burkina Faso. Some argued that the revolution had gone far enough, urging a more moderate path that could bring the country back to the international fold, while others remained steadfast in their belief that Burkina Faso must chart its own course, free from Western interference. Despite these internal divisions, one thing was certain: the revolution had already sparked a fire that could not be extinguished. It was no longer just about Burkina Faso. It was about Africa's future. The revolution, led by Traoré, had inspired Africans across the continent to rise up and reclaim their sovereignty. From Mali to Niger, African leaders began to question the long-standing influence of foreign powers in their nations. For the first time, African nations were coming together to challenge the global powers that had long held them in a state of dependency and exploitation. The question was no longer whether African countries could stand on their own. It was about how quickly they could reclaim their independence and power. In Burkina Faso, the struggle was far from over. While the revolution had brought the country's people together, it also placed the country on a precarious path. As the international pressure intensified, foreign-backed rebel groups began to emerge within the country, further destabilizing the government. Burkina Faso was facing a battle on multiple fronts, not just from external forces, but from within. Yet despite these mounting challenges, Traoré's leadership remained a beacon of hope for millions. His unwavering commitment to the cause of African sovereignty inspired not only the people of Burkina Faso, but also the broader Pan-African movement. In the face of increasing instability, Traoré continued to emphasize the need for unity among Africans. His words resonated deeply with those who had long been frustrated by the exploitation of their countries. Africa, he reminded them, had the resources and the potential to thrive on its own, but achieving that vision would require solidarity, resilience, and a deep commitment to the cause of freedom. The revolution in Burkina Faso had become a symbol of resistance, not just against Burkina Faso's former colonial masters, but against the entire system of neocolonialism that had plagued Africa for decades. Western powers, particularly France, continued to exert pressure on Burkina Faso, accusing Traoré of threatening regional stability and destabilizing the Sahel. France had long relied on its influence in Africa to maintain control over the continent's vast resources. The revolution in Burkina Faso was a direct challenge to that power. But despite the mounting pressure, the people of Burkina Faso stood firm in their belief that their resources belonged to them. They would not allow foreign powers to continue exploiting their land, their wealth, and their people. As the revolution spread, the world began to take notice. African nations, once divided by colonial borders and foreign influence, began to see Burkina Faso's fight as their own. The call for unity and sovereignty echoed across the continent as leaders began to embrace the idea that Africa could and must stand on its own. The battle for Africa's resources had been waged for centuries, but Burkina Faso's revolution marked a turning point. The question was no longer whether Africa could succeed in breaking free from colonial domination. It was a matter of when. The revolution in Burkina Faso had become the catalyst for a broader movement, one that was challenging the very foundations of the global economic and political system. The world was watching as Africa took its first steps toward true independence. But despite the growing momentum, the revolution was not without its challenges. The internal political divisions, the external threats from foreign-backed rebel groups, and the economic strain placed on the country by international sanctions were beginning to take their toll. The government of Burkina Faso was fighting a war on two fronts, one against foreign powers and one against internal fragmentation. Yet, even as the revolution faced growing challenges, the people remained united in their vision for a free and independent Africa. The future of Burkina Faso and of Africa itself now rested on the strength and determination of its people. The revolution had already reshaped the political landscape of Burkina Faso. But the question remained, could it reshape Africa as a whole? Would the people of Burkina Faso succeed in securing their sovereignty? Or would the forces of imperialism crush their dreams of a free and prosperous future? The stakes had never been higher. The outcome of this revolution would have far-reaching consequences, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. The world was waiting to see how the revolution would unfold. The next chapter in Africa's fight for freedom was about to be written, and Burkina Faso was leading the charge. As Burkina Faso's revolution continued to capture the attention of the world, the forces pushing against its movement grew more aggressive. While the people's will remained strong, the country faced increasing internal and external pressures that threatened to derail its progress. The foreign-backed rebel groups had been wreaking havoc, and now they were joined by new adversaries: covert operations, political instabilities, and economic sanctions. Yet, despite the chaos and the mounting dangers, the revolutionary spirit in Burkina Faso was far from extinguished. The people were rallying around their cause with unprecedented unity, driven by a single mission: to reclaim their country's sovereignty and its future. For Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the stakes had never been higher. His leadership had become synonymous with Africa's struggle against neocolonialism and foreign exploitation, but the price of standing firm was steep. Burkina Faso's economy, once reliant on foreign powers, was now under siege. Western sanctions had begun to affect every aspect of life, making it more difficult for the government to operate effectively. The country's gold reserves, which were once a source of prosperity, had become a point of contention. The West saw these resources as essential to their interests, and they were not willing to let Burkina Faso take control without a fight. As the international community, particularly the United States and France, ramped up their efforts to destabilize the government, Traoré's response was unwavering. He doubled down on his stance for African sovereignty, calling for unity across the continent. His message was clear: Africa could no longer allow itself to be dominated by foreign interests. The era of exploitation had to end. Yet the battle for control of Burkina Faso's resources was not just a matter of political power. It was also about economic survival. The economic sanctions had created a dire situation for the people, causing widespread shortages and limiting the country's ability to trade and function on the global stage. To combat these pressures, the government under Traoré focused on strengthening its domestic resources, turning to local industries, and finding alternative partners who would support Burkina Faso's quest for independence. This meant forging alliances with other African nations, some of which had been on the fringes of international politics. Burkina Faso's revolution had sparked a wider movement across the continent, and leaders in Mali, Niger, and beyond were beginning to take similar stands against foreign control. But with these new alliances came new challenges. The West, unwilling to lose its grip on the region, began working behind the scenes to sabotage these efforts. There were reports of covert operations to undermine the revolutionary governments, spread disinformation, and destabilize the new alliances. Despite the obstacles, the revolution was continuing to inspire the people of Burkina Faso. Every street, every village, and every corner of the country was filled with people who believed in a future where their resources belonged to them, not to foreign corporations or governments. This wasn't just about taking back gold and oil, it was about taking back their dignity. Traoré's leadership, which had been questioned by some from the start, now stood as a testament to the strength of the Burkinabe people. His refusal to yield to external pressure gave hope to millions of Africans who had long been deprived of the opportunity to control their futures. Yet, even as the revolution made headway, the situation remained fragile. The risk of civil war loomed large as factions within the military and the government struggled for control over how the revolution should proceed. While most of the population stood firmly behind Traoré, dissenters within the ranks questioned whether the pursuit of absolute sovereignty was worth the economic hardship. The rebels, backed by foreign powers, continued to infiltrate, feeding the flames of instability. The true battle for Burkina Faso's future, then, wasn't just a military one. It was a battle for the soul of the nation. Would the revolution succeed in uniting the people under a common cause? Or would it fracture under the weight of both internal divisions and foreign manipulation? The answer was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Burkina Faso's revolution had set the stage for a much larger movement. The revolution, though rooted in the struggles of one country, had become a beacon for the rest of Africa. Burkina Faso's defiance had shown that Africa didn't have to continue being the pawn of foreign interests. It could rise, it could stand on its own, and it could control its own future. As the revolution reached new heights, the stakes grew ever higher. Burkina Faso's future was at a crossroads. It could either succumb to the pressures of foreign powers and internal strife or emerge victorious, setting a precedent for other African nations to follow. This was a pivotal moment, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the entire continent. The revolution in Burkina Faso was about more than just one leader. It was about an entire continent waking up to its potential. The people had shown their courage. They had shown their resolve. But the real question was, would they be able to protect that hope from the forces that sought to crush it? Only time would tell if the revolution would succeed in claiming the future of Burkina Faso, and by extension, the future of Africa itself. As the revolution in Burkina Faso reached its climax, the struggle for sovereignty took on an even more urgent tone. The people, united under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, had fought for months, but the pressure from foreign powers remained unrelenting. France and its allies had continued to push for Burkina Faso's submission, using every tool at their disposal: sanctions, political pressure, and even covert military operations. The world watched as the country stood firm in the face of adversity, with the revolutionaries showing no signs of backing down. For Captain Traoré, the battle had become more than just a fight for his country. It had become a fight for Africa's dignity, for its future. His refusal to yield to Western powers was not just about Burkina Faso's resources or political power. It was about sending a message to the rest of Africa that sovereignty and independence were possible, even in the face of overwhelming external pressure. As the months wore on, however, the challenges grew. The economic sanctions imposed by the West had begun to take a toll on the country's already fragile economy. The gold mines, once the country's most valuable asset, had become a point of contention, with rebel groups and foreign-backed forces attempting to seize control. The cost of the revolution was mounting, and there were signs of internal divisions among the government and military leaders. Factions within the government began to emerge, some advocating for a more moderate approach, while others, fiercely loyal to Traoré's vision of total sovereignty, insisted that the country must stay the course. The risks of internal conflict were growing, and the fear of a civil war loomed large. But despite these challenges, the spirit of defiance that had fueled the revolution never wavered. The people of Burkina Faso had shown remarkable resilience, refusing to be crushed under the weight of foreign influence or internal strife. The streets of Lomé were filled with chants of freedom and sovereignty. Across the country, the message was clear: Burkina Faso would not bow to foreign manipulation. But as the stakes continued to rise, the question remained: would Burkina Faso be able to withstand the combined forces of foreign pressure and internal division? The revolution had already begun to shape the future of the continent. Leaders from across Africa had rallied behind Burkina Faso's fight for independence. Countries like Mali, Niger, and others in the Sahel region saw their struggles mirrored in Burkina Faso's defiance. The movement for Pan-African sovereignty was gaining momentum, and it was becoming clear that this was no longer just about one country. It was about Africa's future as a whole. Africa had long been the target of foreign exploitation. Its resources had been plundered, its people oppressed, and its governments controlled by outside forces. But now, with the revolution in Burkina Faso, Africa was beginning to stand up and demand what was rightfully its own. The question now was whether the continent would continue to unite behind Burkina Faso's example, or whether the forces of imperialism would succeed in crushing the hope of a free and independent Africa. The world was watching closely as Burkina Faso fought for its survival. The revolution had already ignited a fire across Africa, but whether it would continue to burn or be extinguished by external forces was yet to be seen. As the situation in Burkina Faso reached its breaking point, the international community was forced to reckon with the reality that Africa's fight for sovereignty could no longer be ignored. Burkina Faso had become the symbol of resistance, and its revolution had sparked a conversation that was reverberating across the globe. Would the West finally acknowledge Africa's right to self-determination? Or would it continue to exploit and manipulate the continent for its own benefit? The revolution in Burkina Faso had reached a critical juncture. The people of Burkina Faso had shown the world that they would not be silenced. Their defiance had become a rallying cry for Africans everywhere who were tired of being subjugated. The question now was whether the revolution would succeed in claiming the future of Burkina Faso, or whether the forces of imperialism would once again dominate the continent. The world waited as the final chapter of this revolution unfolded. Burkina Faso's future and the future of Africa hung in the balance.